Welcome everybody to this live stream event. I'm Mitch McMillan, product specialist from Panasonic Australia. And today we've got Ewen Bell with us, who is going to be going through the art of bird photography. And today, if you could leave your comments in the chat, and we'll get you to pop those in, and I'll ask a couple of questions to Ewen throughout the talk. With this conversation, we wanted to, I guess, give you guys some tips on our photography competition that we've got going at the moment, which is birding, hashtag birding with Lumix. And with this competition, we're giving away a Lumix G9 and a 100 to 400mm lens. It's a cracking combo for bird photography, and we've got Ewen here who's going to be helping us today. So, Ewen, welcome.
Hi, Mitch. How you doing? Great to see that people are going to get a brand new camera, because the one I've got has been well and truly scratched up, and the road it's traveled is long and dusty.
You've been using it for quite a while now, haven't you? You've had it, what? Well, one of them you've had for about, what, probably 3 years now, I think it is?
3.5 years, I think. Yeah. In fact, I went to take some shots of the camera today to put into the presentation and realized, wow, this camera has seen some miles. It really has.
Yeah.
And it keeps going. It's been fantastic.
So what was your first shoot that you went and did with the G9?
Well, the first one I got from you guys before they'd quite hit the shelves, and the firmware was brand new, and that kind of stuff. That was on a trip to Kenya, and usually when I go to Kenya, I would take a full frame camera. So I was kind of nervous about whether a smaller camera could do the job and whether that was a good thing to do. But I don't like to travel with two different camera systems. It kind of makes your life hard. So I trusted the G9, and of course it's easy to get shots of the giraffe and the lions and that kind of stuff with any camera. You can do that with an iPad, but the birds are really hard. And for me, I just completely rediscovered the joy of shooting birds, because with the G9, one of the things that I could do is that the walk from my tent in the camp to go to lunch at the restaurant tent, which would be maybe 100 or 200 feet, it would take me an hour, because I would see so many birds and I could get my shots, and I could get great shots. And for me, that joy just to spend time in a small space with lots of birds and to actually get some really good shots, that was fantastic. And of course, with something that's so easy to carry.
So in your presentation today, we're going to go through a couple of your greatest tips in terms of going out and shooting. You're going to go through your philosophies of, I guess, bird photography as well. And the conversation's not going to be about, I guess, the scientific version of bird photography and capturing those, I guess, absolute elusive birds that you're going to be sitting out for, 10 days and sitting in a watering hole. It's about going out and shooting and enjoying in your backyard. And I think one of those things that we like to, I guess, talk about with the G9 just in general is that you can go out and you can shoot while you're going for a coffee. Like, you can walk into the park, you can go into your backyard, you can shoot from your balcony, you can get out there and I guess enjoy taking photos. It's not like you have to go on a trek to get those nice photos of wildlife.
Yeah, that's right. The level of planning that you need just to go to the park and take some shots of birds is just really easy with a G9, because it goes into any bag. Whereas in the old days, you'd think, well, I'm going to have to load up the car with gear, and to pack in a tripod, and half the back seat is one lens and all this kind of stuff. It was something you had to show a little bit more dedication to go out and chase birds. And I feel that the thing that's really changed is that now, with a camera like the G9 and with that lens, a 100 to 400mm lens, is so light and so powerful. And it just, the smallest birds are the hardest birds. And hopefully with the presentation, you'll get to see some really, really small birds, but they're brought up really close because the gear is so good.
Yeah, great. I know you've got a wealth of photography knowledge, and we're really just going down the path of birds for this conversation. So we definitely want to have the opportunity in later talks. And if you guys are enjoying this this conversation, then yeah, leave your notes in the comments, and hopefully we can do some more talks on your favorite topics. So. As I've also said, we've got all the comments in there. Let us know where you're tuning in from. I think you put a post out on your Twitter page, and we're
That's
obviously
right.
speaking to.
Hi, Tweeps. Good to see you.
So okay, let's get into it. If you want to pop up your presentation for us, Ewen.
We'll know we're in the right spot when we see one of our lovely rainbow bee eaters. All right.
Great.
All right. Birding with Lumix. Okay. So the problem with birds is that they're really, really small. They're actually quite hard to photograph as a subject if you can't get close enough, because birds generally like to stay away from people. Here's a little patch of the outback that's up near the Kimberleys. Bullo River is a cattle station, but it's also a habitat for lots of really, really beautiful birds. And you can see this is a wide open space. There's a lot of terrain here, and somewhere in the middle of all this space, we're looking for a bird that's this size. These little starfinches, they come into some of the watering holes. And you know, they don't want to be.
How big are they, Ewan?
Sorry,
how big are they?
How big is that? Well, that would be slightly larger than maybe a couple of thumbs. Sorry, it's hard to describe how big a bird is, because if you say the weight of a bird, it sounds like crazy. You think, so that bird's probably something like 30 grams, and that sounds really, really tiny. But they'd be smaller than your coffee cup. And they're just beautiful. And the detail of how the stars actually come out, the spots that come out on the feathers, that's something that's very hard to see unless you're close enough. And it's something which I didn't really see properly and clearly until I start to walk out there with a camera and a very long lens. You know, so the lens is doing half the work to get me in there. So the problem with birds, 99.999% of birds don't want their photo taken. But that's okay, because the 0.001% that let us get close, they're the birds we're going to photograph. So here we've got a forest kingfisher. He's in Arhnemland, and this is where he lives. So this particular billabong, we go out with groups and we put them into the boats, and we go out on these really, really flat boats, and we kind of drift around, and we try to get close to the birds that are on the edge. But this kingfisher, he was kind of a juvenile and quite young, and he was just basically hanging out where we launched the boats. So because the guides will come into the same spot to launch the boats, and they'll do that in the mornings, they'll do that in the afternoons, and they'll do that every day. And so this bird was a little bit more tolerant of us actually pointing a camera at him, and didn't actually fly off and disappear and all that kind of stuff. So the key thing is the majority of birds, they don't want their photos taken, but the ones who are actually tolerant of people, they're the ones we're going to get shots of. They're the ones that we're going to get a little bit closer to. So in the outback, there are two ways that you can find a spot where you might be able to come close to the birds that you're looking at. You either got to find them when they're after their food or when they're after their water. So this picture is from Purnululu National Park. Gorgeous, gorgeous park that's on the edge of the Kimberleys. It's not far from Kununurra. The road from Kununurra to Purnululu is horrendous. The corrugation everywhere is just absolutely diabolical. It will tear your car to pieces, but it's worth it. This is the view that you get. And this park is absolutely covered in a grevillea. They have a couple of different kinds, and the honeyeaters love these flowers. And so you can basically stand on the edge of the road, and you can be in a sea of grevilleas or go on the walking trails, and you're surrounded by grevilleas. and you're surrounded by birds too. And so if you're there at the right time of day, the right time of the year, and obviously the right time of day, the birds are basically going to be coming in to make the most of the nectar and the flowers. So understanding the food that the birds want is a really good way to understand where you might see some birds. This little guy, this little double-barred finch, he hasn't come in for food. He's come in for water. And this particular spot, there was a spot where there's a pipeline that goes from the camp through to the road. And there's like a junction there where they can turn off the water supply, and it kind of leaks a bit. And so the tap on the junction basically just has a drip. And for the birds, this is just absolutely fantastic. They're in this very dry habitat. It's a wide open kind of space. The rivers don't run for most of the year. And suddenly there's this little tiny source of water. And the finches would come in, the zebra finches, the double-barred, and some of the larger birds too. Trying to think of the name now. So the birds come in because there's water. And so the trick with all of this is to look for things that the birds are interested in. And that's when you find the birds. So in the city, it's a little bit different. The rules in terms of the food and water, they still work, but it's a different kind of habitat. And the thing about the parks in the city, and here's where I live on the Yarra River, there are parklands here. There are parklands right around the city, but the birds in the city are much more tolerant of humans because they've decided they're going to live here, and they see these humans every day, and they're just a lot more tolerant. And I'm sure that there's tons of people in the suburbs too who see these cockatoos who come into their backyards, or perhaps even come into their balconies, and that they're very people tolerant, these birds, or at least some of them are. The majority of cockatoos still won't go near people, but there are some that do, and those are the ones we're more likely to get photographs of. And in your city, there'll be parks that will probably have parrots and pardalotes and honeyeaters and wrens and owls and lots of other birds. It's amazing how much wildlife are in these parks right in the middle of the city and in the urban spaces. There's a lot of birds out there. And here's one that you can see almost all over the country, the superb Fairy-Wren. And at this time of year, the boys are getting a little bit interested in things, and they're starting to plump up their plumage. And also at this time of year, the birds are a little bit braver because they want to engage with the mating season, and so it's a time of year when they can be a little bit less shy. This particular guy, he and a girl that he was courting, they were just passing by while I sat on a bench. Something that I need to point out, that all of the photos that you're seeing here in this particular presentation, there's no bird call, there's no feed, there isn't anything to entice the birds in. I'm simply taking shots of birds that are allowing me to get close enough to take a shot. And here we've got the evening light. The light is about to go over the hill. There's not much light, it's quite soft at this time of night. It's quite low, but that's okay. The camera does the work to get the most out of the light that is on offer on this occasion.
And so when you're shooting, obviously you're talking about obviously knowing where the birds are coming from and when they're going to be around. Is there certain times that are better?
Well, generally I like to go out either in the first hour of light or the last hour of the light, because the light is softer, it's kinder. The birds are generally more active because in the mornings they're cold and they need to eat because they're hungry, and in the evenings they know they're going to be cold and that they try to snack up. That said, most of the time I go out whenever I can. So in the winter time, the winter lights are pretty gentle compared to summer. I don't like going out in the middle of summer when it's like 38 degrees and everything is cooked and the birds are just trying to stay out of the heat at that time of day.
Yeah.
But as soon as things start to cool off, and it's, in the summertime, the last hour of light is always the best, and the first hour of light is always the best too. So they're the 2 times a day which I prefer.
And from seasons wise, is there certain times where you find they're more in the city, or?
Well, when it comes to seasons, there are birds that are actually going to be on the move. So there are birds that are either heading north or heading south. Generally, they're going to where the food is, right? So that there are times a year, right about now, you'll see there are heaps of parrots that are heading south because, they're going to go to Tassie because the summer's coming there, and that's where they're going to have some food, and perhaps they're going to nest and to breed. So it depends on the bird. And even the tiniest of birds, the really, really small ones, they also tend to migrate. So the wrens, however, they tend to be in the same spot. You can find wrens pretty much anywhere, I would think. I think they're pretty easy to find. Certainly in the cities, they're relatively tolerant, and they like areas that have grass and a little bit of shrubs. So if there's a particular bird that you want to see, you kind of have to get to know the habits of that bird.
Yeah.
So just to step back to the outback, one of my tips for finding really good birds to photograph is to head for the car park. Even in the outback, to head for the car park. So here we are at Uluru. Uluru is an amazing park to spend time in. It really is one of the most beautiful parks in the world. And you'll find lots of beautiful birds there. So this is the Mistletoebird, and this is one of the birds that I was talking about that actually travels quite a way. This bird, for all we know, could have come from South Australia or Victoria, or even further south, perhaps. So the Mistletoebird, as you can see from this photo, is not very big. In this shot, he's having a bit of a hack at the rock fig, and he's having a good time. Mostly they like to eat the actual mistletoe fruit, and then they lay seeds. When they eat the fruit, the seeds go through, and they plant the seeds, so to speak, on the branches with kind of a gelatinous shell that helps the seeds to get started, and then the mistletoe grows on the branch and things keep on going, and then they get food. So this shot was taken on the edge of Uluru. I'm actually standing close enough to Uluru to actually touch the rock, and this particular rock fig was simply a great spot for the mistletoes and the honey eaters to come in and have a snack. But in the car park at the start of the walk, I found these guys. And this was actually the first time I'd seen this particular bird. It's a yellow-rumped thornbill. And we'd parked the car, and we were about to walk off to go into this walk that takes you close into the rock. It's a really, really beautiful walk. And I just saw this flock of thornbills just basically hit these shrubs, and they're going through the shrubs trying to find things to eat and to snack on. And they're totally used to cars just turning up right next to the path there. And they weren't fussed by the cars being there. They weren't fussed by me being there. And I probably got a good sort of 2 minutes or 3 minutes with this flock just going through this little shrub. Incredibly fast bird. They don't stand still for long. They move a lot. But to have that chance just to get really close and to get some really good shots of these birds was an absolute treat for me. So, the tip is, from the car park, you're going to see birds that are really, really tolerant of people. And when you go to a place like Uluru, just wait till all the rest of the people have gone, and just watch all the birds basically come into the car park. They'll come in to try to find some snacks. They'll come in to a spot where there might be some water. I've seen all kinds of things like the wrens, and obviously the Mistletoebirds and the wood swallows. So many kind of birds will come into the car park, including the finch, the zebra finch.
And that's, I guess, it's not like the baiting and trying to sit and put food in certain locations. It's actually just going to where their natural habitat sort of change, that they're used to it. So
That's right. You're talking about wild birds who are basically adjusting to our impact in their landscape. The ones who come into the car parks are the ones who are, slightly less shy than the rest of the population. And they're the birds that you're going to have a crack at, and you don't need to use callbacks or to entice them with food and all that kind of stuff. They're simply going to come in and check it out. And the zebra finches, when a flock of those guys come through and they're all chirping away, the noises they make are absolutely fantastic.
You're also having a little bit more compositional ability for these shots as well, because they're obviously not as scared of you that you're stuck in a hidey hole or whatever shooting with the long lens. You're actually being able to move around with it.
That's a really good point. If you can spend time with these kind of birds that are far more tolerant, you just get a better chance to practice your craft and to see what the camera can do and to see what it can't do and to see where you need to improve your technique, or just to practice. It's all about practice when it comes to this kind of stuff. And that if you actually focus on things like, and it sounds crazy, but the birds in the car park, it's one of those areas where you actually get to spend some quality time with the birds, and that they're used to people enough that you can spend a little bit more time without them flying away. And a moment like this, like, I will treasure this moment. I recall the exact spot where I'm standing, and here there's just a shrub that's on the edge of like this corner between two streets. And every time I've gone to this particular spot, and it's quite near the hotel at Uluru. Every time I've gone there, within a couple of minutes, the finches come through because they're just curious. They want to see what I'm actually doing there, and they come in to check it out, and I get a bunch of photos. It's beautiful. So I just want to briefly talk about this idea that you can sneak up on birds. You can't. They're very, very clever. Birds see everything. This idea that if you wear the right kind of clothing, that they won't notice that you're not a tree or something. I don't think that's the thing. I really don't. Birds see everything. They decide if they're going to let you take the photo or not. And, here I'm trying to take a photo of the parrot, and he decides he's going to sit on me. They have the choice. They make the decision, not you. So I'm not really into this idea of trying to sneak up on them. Whereas I am into the idea of trying to find the birds that are tolerant of us people. So once you work out your strategy for where you're going to find some birds, your next strategy is, what kind of gear do you need? And the smaller the bird, the bigger the lens you want. And strangely enough, the smaller the camera, the bigger the lens you end up with. So the Micro Four Thirds, and this comes back to the Lumix G9, because that's the camera which I use. That's one of the Micro Four Thirds cameras by Panasonic. When you put a 400mm lens on a G9, you get an 800mm perspective. And that's because it's got a smaller sensor. So the size of the sensor means that even though the lens will tell you 400mm, you're actually shooting at 800. And that's really useful. Having a smaller camera and a smaller lens, but having a very long telephoto reach, that's really useful. So here's a Pardalote. This young lady is kind of curious and kind of doesn't really want to be seen. She's hiding in the branches there. If this shot was taken at 400mm, this is a shot you would have got at 800mm. Just to give you the comparison as to what that means, as to how close that you get. And indeed, I think that for most people, even getting this close, usually they're talking about a speck that's on a branch, and that it's hard to see the bird at all. Most of the birds, we just can't get close enough to. So the longer the lens you have, the closer you can get to the bird in terms of the photograph. And that's really useful. So the starting point for what do you need to actually go out and chase some birds, I'm going to say that you need a telephoto that's at least 400mm. So if you have the 400 on the G9, you've got 800. So 400 is okay, 600 is better, 800 is fantastic. Okay, so you want as much telephoto as you can get your hands on. You want an excellent autofocus.
Yeah, I think also just one thing on there is when you're going into these longer lenses, you need to think about if you're shooting the birds from longer distances, and obviously things like people go, oh, okay, can I chuck a teleconverter on this lens to try and make this lens super long? And they're shooting from miles away, and then they're getting atmospheric problems because there's heat and all that sort of stuff between it. So I think there's most of the shots that you're trying to get generally with those 800 mils are generally quite tight images where you're nice and close to the bird.
Yeah, that's true. There comes a point where simply having a longer lens is not going to help you because of the heat haze. And so if you have a larger bird, and I think that in here we should have some shots of the Brolga. That's a pretty decent sized bird. You don't have to be very close. It still helps to have an 800 mil lens. 400 mil is good, but 800 mil is generally better. And the great thing with the 100 to 400 on the G9, which I've got, is that you can work through that range. You can choose to start at one end and go through to the other. And so that kind of flexibility is really, really handy. So you want a seriously long lens. You're not shooting these things with a 50 mil lens. You want an autofocus that is really seriously good because the birds move fast and you need all the help you can get to nail it. You want a quality viewfinder so you can actually see where you're training your autofocus. That's really important. And you want really good dynamic range in the sensor. It's something that doesn't come up a lot with this kind of conversation, but it should. The quality of the sensor is really, really critical. And as we'll see as we get into these slides, the dynamic range is key thing with the G9.
And just by dynamic range, you mean the tones from dark to lights and where you can adjust those while you're editing them.
Yeah, that's right. And we have a couple of slides on that to come. So here's what I shoot with. It's a little bit scratched up, and I've tried to hide the dust marks and all the scratches and things like that. But it's small. It's really, really compact. This is the 10-liter peak design sling thingy. It's a small camera. I get an 800 mil kind of perspective, and it's image stabilized, so I can do everything handheld.
It's a fashionable bum bag, aren't they?
The bags are great. They're really good. And you can actually get two cameras in here. I can get the G9 with the telephoto plus a G9 with a wide angle in the same bag, plus a couple of extra things as well. I can get all that in this little tiny bag, and it's a great way to work, let me tell you.
So really, from a weight perspective, that combination there is what, sub 2 kilos, I think, from memory.
Yeah. The combination that's in that shot, you're looking at 1.48 or something like that. Like it's really, really light.
Less than 1.5 kilos. And then you've also got your other lenses that you can have on the side as well. So
that's right. And of course, I'm always too lazy to change the lenses when I'm out there. So in fact, I need a second camera body with the wide angle if I'm ever going to shoot the wide angle. But it's the long lens, that 800 mil handheld. That's what's really key. I just want to quickly have a little look at autofocus because it's something that people either tend to overanalyze and sort of get the wrong end of, or just don't think about enough. There are two things you need. You need it to be precise. You need it to be flexible, because there are different ways that you need your autofocus to work in different kind of situations. When I talk about precision, and that's one of the things that I love about this camera, the precision of the autofocus, being able to peer through a whole bunch of branches and land it right on my subject. That kind of accuracy is really, really key. And the other thing is the flexibility, that I can quickly go from that tiny scene where I'm trying to peer through the branch and actually throw the autofocus to use the entire screen, the entire sensor, and to catch a bird in flight. So that sort of flexibility is really, really key. The other two things I'll say about the autofocus, the two things that I like about the G9, it's got a generous viewfinder. And this is a big thing, because it doesn't matter how good the autofocus is if you can't see where you're landing it. And on the G9, it's really good. So you need that larger viewfinder so that you can control the autofocus to what you need.
So when you're talking about that, you're talking about resolution and then also magnification in terms of how big it is. And I guess one of the benefits of mirrorless is what you see is what you get through the viewfinder. You're seeing your exposure. You're also then seeing where your autofocus point is positioned, and if you want to shoot automatic and shoot in, which you will talk about in a little bit, you're actually seeing what your exposure compensation and all that sort of stuff is doing in the background, that it's not just watching the needle like you would on a DSLR.
That's right. And this particular feature, the point scope, being able to zoom in and be very, very precise to pick out the eyeball of a very small bird, that's where the autofocus and the way that you can drive the autofocus becomes very, very powerful.
So what you're talking about here, Ewan, with that scope focus, is the zoom in functionality of that. And do you have that later in the presentation?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So we'll quickly, just to comment about the autofocus as well, regardless of what lens that you're putting on, because the lens is doing a lot of the work here, don't forget, but regardless of what lens, you need to think about what can I do to help my autofocus work the best that it can. And so you need to get to know the ways in which the autofocus on your camera works, so that you'll then know how to respond to different kind of situations when those moments come up. And that's just practice. And the more time you spend with the birds, and again, look for them in the car park. That's a great way to get a better opportunity to spend some time with birds and just see how different ways to drive the autofocus work for you. One of the things to note with the G9 is that it's got an animal detect feature, which will basically shows you on the screen where it can see, whether it's a bird or a dog or a person. I believe they pick up people as well, but it will land the focus where it sees an animal, and then when you tap the shutter, it basically will choose that spot to bring the focus into. But there are complicated situations when you might need to be a little bit more in control yourself in terms of driving the autofocus. And here's one. This crimson finch is a very, very difficult subject. We're on a boat. We're drifting the whole time, so the boat's not actually standing still. And I'm trying to nail this guy through a bunch of reeds. And he's got a whole bunch of girls as well. It's like a whole harem that he's got going on. But he's the guy that I want because he's got all the color. And so I'm trying to land that autofocus on him. So if I use a very small AF area, if I keep it small, then I can try to find that point through the reeds, and I'm trying to find the edge of the wing there because that's a good sort of depth and that's got some contrast. And so I'm going to use a different way to autofocus than, say, if I had a larger subject or larger bird. Because if I use that larger AF zone, then what's going to happen is it might actually catch the reeds in front instead of capturing the finch. It's hard to say because there's all sorts of things it could actually catch on. So by scaling the AF area to meet the size of the target that you're trying to hit, that's one area that you can be flexible. But there's also something else that you do, and it comes back to the point scope that we were just talking about. And that same scene with that larger AF area, if I simply activate the point scope, now the screen enlarges and I can have a lot more control over where I land the actual focus point. Would you like to explain how that works, Mitch, the different options? It's quite technical.
Yeah, so from a technical perspective, what it's basically doing is giving you your autofocus area where Ewan was talking about it being nice and narrow, and it will allow the camera to zoom in on that focus point. So where Ewan's got that box pictured on the screen there, the autofocus area, when you press a custom button on the front of the camera, will actually magnify that in, and then you can use your autofocus, whether it's your finger on the shutter or the back button AF, and that will autofocus on that point. There's a couple of options depending on your style of photography, whether you want it to be full screen and it just sees that and you don't get any overview of actually what is in your framing, or you can have it as like a picture-in-picture where it just zooms in on the inside area and you can sort of see the rest of it. So it's focus functionality like this that I guess gives you that ability where you're trying to get through those little spots, like where Ewan's talking about here with the foliage in front. So,
alrighty. And we just want to make one comment that the biggest mistake you can make with your autofocus is to use a smaller, like a too small area, or even just a single point. If your point is too small, you may miss your subject entirely. And also, if you're hitting an area that's really washed out by the sun that's coming into the lens, or that if it's an area that's just really dark and doesn't have any light, you don't want to use an area that's too small. So here we have the Brolga going past really early in the morning. The sun has only just actually started to come across the landscape. It's very soft light. I'm at a very high ISO, and I want that autofocus to land on the birds. I'm going to use a large zone. I'm going to use a really generous part of the screen because I'm going to trust the camera is going to find that bird. And if I use a too small a zone, I might miss the bird entirely, and that won't help at all. Now we're going to talk a little bit about dynamic range. I know this stuff might seem kind of boring, but it's really important when it comes to processing your raw files. We don't always get to shoot in the best light that we would like. And here's a case with this, the Finch. I'm in the middle of the day. It's maybe not a great time to be out. I was actually doing something else and happened to have my camera on me, and a bunch of these guys came through and I had to take a photo. So it's harsh light, but the camera's dynamic range gives me a lot of flexibility when it comes time to process. And that's important both in terms of if the light was tricky or if you simply screw up a bit. So in this case, this was overexposed by about 1.5 stops, and I had to pull it back a fair way, and I still get the shot I want because I've got that flexibility within the file, and that I can then either to pull back the contrast or to bring up the shadow detail or drop down the highlights. All that comes into play if your raw file has a lot of dynamic range. So it sounds like a scary word, but it's actually really handy when you get it on the desktop.
When you're shooting, I don't think we talk about this much, but are you shooting in JPEG or RAW or?
Raw, always raw. Okay. Always raw. So I use a Capture One to process my files. It's a good workhorse, and that it gives me really quick access to the best of the raw file. And so the combination of the G9 with your raw processing software is absolutely fantastic.
And you're getting that ability to adjust the file where the JPEG's I guess, compiled image that doesn't really have that flexibility to change that exposure. So that's right. So the raw file you could think of it as having layers of information, and that when you pull it into the raw workflow software, you're choosing where to work through those layers and which bits of information to pull through. With a JPEG, you've just got a flat sheet, and if something's blown out as a JPEG, it's gone. It's not coming back. And if something's underexposed as a JPEG, there's not a lot to pull back either. So you just have a lot more data to work with, and the raw file is not yet an image. It's like the potential of it is huge. So as I say, the processing is actually half the job. And it's not just that you can fix up something that got kind of like screwed up.
like I just showed you, but you actually have creative options. And so here's a shot where I'm shooting back right into that sunlight. Absolutely, it's blaring out on the water's edge. But with the raw file, I can choose which bits I'm going to pull up for detail, which bits I'm going to flatten out, which bits I want to go black in silhouette, which bits I just want to, to hold onto the highlights so it's not totally blown up. So I think of raw files as being your a creative tool, and it's also true that you can get the best out of the image, whereas with the JPEG, if you didn't get it just right when you shot it, you may never get it just right. So that was sort of a fair bit of the technical stuff, and we will come back to look a little bit more closer at the camera itself in a minute, but I want to talk about the creative side a little bit more, because often when we're talking about a photography of birds, people just want to see what the bird is, and they just want to prove that they've seen that shot. If you're a photographer, you want to enjoy the photography. You want to create a beautiful scene. And that's where composition and light come into it. And so composition is so important. You don't just want a bird and just the frame just to be empty. You want to see that context. You want to see the environment the bird comes from. And to do that, you need to leave some space. And again, here we have one of the zebra finches that's come into some water that's on a pipe that leaks by the side of the road. But having the bush in there, this particular bush that's really, really common in the Kimberleys, it tells you something about where the bird is, the way it's perching. We're seeing a little bit of the habitat, and it puts the bird into context, and I've got some composition. And so you just want to leave some space for composition, which with the smaller birds is not usually a problem, but with the bigger birds, you still want to try to leave some space for composition.
Some environmental portraiture.
Environmental portrait, right. And then layers. One of the things that I try to aim for, I like to shoot through things. I like to be peering through the foliage and have the layers in there too. And when you have a 400mm lens, you've got a lot of you've got a small depth of field because it's such a long lens. So things that are outside of the plane of focus go very soft. And I find that really, really beautiful. So the bokeh of the lens, and again, this shot was taken on a G9 with the 100 to 400mm, and it was probably out to 400 because that's usually how I shoot my birds. I'm using the maximum reach of the lens, and so the foliage that I'm peering through goes soft, and even the tail goes soft. Like the difference between the focus on the eye. The plane of focus is so small that by the time that you get to the tail, even that goes soft as well. So aside from composition and layers, light is your number one tool. Light is doing the work. Cameras don't see birds, they see light. And light is what gives a scene its character. So the question is, what is good light? Because it depends on what you're doing and what kind of a creative space you want to step in with your birds. Direct sunlight would be my least favorite light to shoot birds. Here we're in the middle of the day. The angle of the light's pretty steep, so the brow on the robin is not great. And that we've had to really, really pull back on that dynamic range to pull out the shadow detail. It's just harsh. The light's not working for us. The shot's nice, but I think it could be nicer. Here's the same bird right in the early part of the morning.
That looks a completely different bird almost.
You would think so. Well, birds also change their shape with their poses too. So that's part of the fun with birds. And so the light here is actually coming from behind the bird. It's very, very soft light. Again, the ISO is dialed up. And I like the character of this much more. It's much gentler. It's much softer. And I want to play with that light more. And if I change my angle a little bit, then that sunlight actually comes right through onto the lens and it's hitting the lens as well. Now, this style might not appeal to everyone. But it's just, just trying to show you the idea that as you change the character of light you're working with, you change the photography. So if you want to think about the light, not just the subject, and here's sort of the compromise between the backlit and the daylight version, the direct light version. So again, same bird. You'll notice he's a different shape again, but it's the same species. And this time he's just under the canopy of a tree, and I can shoot up below that canopy. There's a couple of little hot spots. There's one on the tail and there's one on the front, just by the beak. There's a couple of little hot spots there, but we have enough dynamic range to smooth out the dark and the shadows and the highlights. But overall, we've got this lovely filtered light. It's much kinder. It's much gentler. We see the detail better here. The light is bringing out that amazing detail of the feathers. You can see the crisscross there. That's the kind of light that I'm going to aim for. That's my favorite light.
You've got the color, the contrast, like the color, like it's direct light. You've still got the shapes of the bird. Like that's really, really nice.
And even though he's actually quite close to all the trees and branches, you still have enough of that depth of field dropping out behind him so that you get some separation between the subject and the branch. So, you get that bokeh effect, without having to have like this, this pristine, empty kind of scene.
And so you'd be shooting at like f6.3 or something on the probably.
That'd be right. Which we come to how to set up the cameras, but essentially I tend to shoot at the minimum depth of field always because I just love the maximum softness in the background.
So also, if anyone has any questions, remember to leave them in the chat box. I will be asking them through. There is a couple of questions in there that I've seen that I know Ewan's going to answer pretty quickly. So I'm just holding off on asking them. So,
all right. So what we want to do is to bring together the technical side and the creative side. And the way I think about the technicalities of this stuff is that we don't need to know everything about the camera and everything about the art of photography and all of the technical stuff. You just want to learn the technical bits that help you towards the creative goal that you have. All right.
People get overly techie on cameras, and then there's other people that are completely on the opposite side. And then when something goes wrong, they don't really know what to do. It's that sweet spot in the middle, isn't it?
Well, I find that the more you're thinking about the camera, the less you're thinking about your photography. So the ones who aren't all that skilled at their camera often are the ones taking better photos, I find.
Yeah.
So my starting point for everything when it comes to birds is always a shutter speed. So the majority of shots you've seen so far, we're talking about a bird that's on a perch and he's just standing there and I've got an even chance to get a shot. I've usually got my shutter set to 200th of a second for those shots. For a bird in flight, that's way too slow and that you need something faster. And that's where I usually have my camera set to 2000 instead of 200. So my starting point is the bird going to be calm enough that I can get a shot at 200, or do I need to dial it up for something that's more active? And even at 2000, sometimes that's not fast enough either, and you may need to go faster. The closer you are to a bird, the more the movement comes through in the frame and the faster your shutter speed needs to be. So the next question is, how do we set that up? And this is where the G9 is kind of the Rolls Royce here, because you've got 3 custom dials. So I can set up my camera ready for a range of different kind of situations and punch it into the custom mode, and I'm good to go. So if you've got a camera that's got like a C1 or a C2 or perhaps even a C3, here's where they come into play. You basically set up your camera with a bunch of settings. You punch that in as your C1, and every time you roll that dial to C1, then all of those settings are locked in. And it means you know what your camera is going to do before you pick it up. And that's quite handy, because if you just shot something in a different scene, you may have the camera set up wrong for the next scene that's coming up. So by using these custom modes to set your baseline, it means you're able to respond things to really quickly, but also means you've got an opportunity to learn how each of these different settings work. It actually helps you to learn, because if your camera is consistent and then you change just the ISO, or you change the f-stop, or you change your exposure compensation, you get to understand what changing one of those things does if your camera is usually set up in a consistent way. So I'm going to walk you through 3 ways that you could set up your C1, C2, and C3. C1 for my cameras, I've always got this the same on all of my cameras. It's the same. I have my aperture priority set as the mode, and I have the aperture set to the minimum. So if I've got a 1.4 lens on there, then I'm going to be shooting at f1.4. If I've got a 2.8 lens, I'm going to be shooting at f2.8. And on the 100 to 400 mil, when I'm at 100, I think that gives me f4. Is that right?
104. Yeah.
Yep. So, and if I take that out to 400, it goes up to f6.3. I don't spend a lot of time at 100 mils on that lens, I must admit. I always want to get closer to the birds. I can never get close enough, and they're always too small. So my C1, I'm on aperture priority. I have the ISO set to auto, but within that setting, I set the minimum shutter speed and the maximum ISO. So in general, I'm happy to go to ISO 3200. There are times when I need to go higher, but in general, I don't need to, so that's fine. And I know I can work with the raw files when I'm at ISO 3200. I know it's going to look good. So I punch that into the ISO settings. And then you can also set the continuous, the burst mode. So how fast is it going to take the next frame? And generally, I don't want to go beyond 10 frames per second, because otherwise my cards just get really, really full for no reason. And I want my AF area to be relatively small, because I'm trying to land that focus really, really precisely. Usually I'm trying to land it on the eye. And so I have to, control a fairly small area.
And
that's my standard setup.
Image stabilization turned on the lens as well, the lens and the body. Right?
Always on everything. I'm trying to think of an instance when I would turn off the image stabilization. It's just always on. Like I don't really see a downside to it. So,
and I think one thing that a lot of people wouldn't be thinking is that normally they get in this space where you have to have your camera set in manual. It has to be in manual. Everything has to be in manual. It has to be ISO 100 so that there's not noise in the shot.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a discussion point, because you're going to miss shots.
That's right. I recall one place I went to that's really, really famous for birders to go in Queensland. And I popped up to check it out, and I've never seen so many tripods in my life. And these guys, they don't want to go above ISO 100 or whatever, and everything's on a tripod, and it's heavy gear. It's big, heavy gear, and they can't really respond really, really quickly when the bird does something. And also they can't get close to birds because the birds are terrified of this giant tripod clonking down when they move it. So, ISO is not the end of the world. If you're processing the raw file, and if you've got a halfway decent sensor, you can get great shots at higher ISO. I've got shots at 10,000 ISO, which I still kept and published. So when you're in really dark canopy, and it's like, your choice is to have a little bit of grain or just have a blurry bird.
Sure. Yeah.
And it turns out the market for blurry birds is not great. That's what I've discovered. So, the ISO is not the end of the world. Custom mode 2, you can have that set for when birds are flying in the sky. And so you need a faster shutter speed punched in, and you need a larger ISO, a larger AF area. you might want to hire a continuous burst as well. So that's something that I tend to use, a higher, the mode that goes up to 20 frames a second. Usually because if they're basically flapping their wings, I want a couple of frames to choose from, because I don't want the wings in a spot that looks kind of weird or awkward. And, I just want something to choose from. And so usually I've got that dialed up a little bit more. And then a third option is when we use the pre-burst. So it's kind of like the same as the one when the bird's in flight, but we're using the pre-burst feature of the G9 in order to make sure we get the bird in flight. And I'll just explain what that means when it comes to pre-burst.
2 seconds, Ewen. Just back on to, there's just been one of the questions. Maybe go back to the C1 as your starting point there. So the conversation, the question was around like other cameras and that sort of stuff. And I think the point is that all these settings are a baseline, whether you're using a Lumix camera or whether you're using another camera. You're using aperture priority, which a lot of people go, I'm going to shoot sports. I need to select my shutter speed. So I go shutter priority. And that's, I guess, you need to think in the other way, is that you're choosing your aperture and going, I need this shot to be shallow and I know I need to be fast. So I'm going to try and get as much light as possible. So that's where your decisions are coming from there.
Yeah. The key thing to tune into with that is that I'm using the settings in auto ISO. I'm setting the minimum shutter. I'm not actually picking the precise shutter speed. And this makes all of the difference, because often you have too much light. And if you've got too much light, the minimum shutter, the actual shutter speed might have to be at 1,000 instead of 200. Otherwise, you end up, the camera would have to increase the aperture instead of increasing the shutter speed in order to get the correct exposure. And too much aperture, the more aperture you have, so the higher f-stop, the higher that f-stop, the less of that separation you have between the background and the subject. And we want as much of that separation as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. So the key is you're controlling it by using the auto ISO. So you are actually setting like a floor for the shutter speed, so that it won't go too low, so that you'll be sure that at least you're going to be sharp, so that even if the bird isn't always going to be sharp because he might move, but at least you won't have to deal with handshake. And at 200th of a second between the stabilizer and that shutter, you absolutely are going to get sharp shots, beautifully sharp shots.
Yeah, and when you're the normal focal length to shutter speed, so if you're using a camera that doesn't have stabilization, the general rule of thumb is 1 over your focal length. So if you're 100th of it, if you're shooting with 100mm lens, you would have 100th or 125th of a second in terms of your shutter speed. And that's going to give you a sharp shot without any handshake in there. So going up to 800, that's gonna be pretty high, and you're not gonna have much light. So you need to have a very bright lens, and that's where the stabilization systems come in quite handy. So just turning that on inside your camera. But if the bird moves, obviously the bird's going to be blurry because the shutter speed's slow.
And just to emphasize the impact of that, one of the shots in the Bhutan exhibition we had at the festival in Ballarat this time 2 years ago, was a shot taken handheld at 1/80th of a second with an 800mm length at ISO 3200.
How large did you print that?
To the max. That print was something like 15 inches wide by 15. It was a square crop. So that was a generous print, and it was handheld at 800mm of focal length. At an 80th of a second, and it's beautiful. And I couldn't do that without the stabilization really doing the work. And it's the fact that both the camera has the stabilization in the sensor, plus also the lens has its own stabilization, and they work together.
We've got about 5 minutes left on the presentation. And
all right, we might have to speed up a little bit. Well, we're not too far from the end. We just want to basically explain what pre-burst is. Because on the G9, it's got basically two settings. It's got like a 20 frames per second and a 60 frames per second if you really want to dial it up. But pre-burst essentially means the camera is taking shots before you commit the shutter. And here in this particular sequence, we can see on the left-hand side, the bird is still on the branch, and then it starts to launch off. And then on the right-hand side, the bird is in the air and about to leave the frame. And the thing is, where I put the red dot, that's where I hit the shutter. I didn't start actually committing the shutter until here because I'm waiting for the bird to take off. I see the bird take off. My eyes take maybe half a second to register, hopefully less. And then I have to tell my finger to hit the shutter. And so I'm all the way out here before I've actually responded fast enough to hit the shutter. But the camera was set to the pre-burst mode and was already taking all these frames. Does that explain it all right, Mitch?
Yeah, I think it does. And the big difference, so with this mode, this is giving you raw shots when you're doing those. These are all raw photos. Just one of the points is that we do have the ability to, like on our compact cameras, like the FZ1000, for example, which have the really, really long telephoto lenses on them. They have a 4K photo mode, which basically will do the same function on there and do a pre-burst option. And then you just choose the file that you'd want to take out of that shot. So there's plenty of different options inside the cameras.
Whereas here we're getting the full frame in RAW, and it's just a powerful tool. If you absolutely want to get the perfect moment and you don't know when that moment's going to happen, that's when the pre-burst is just magic, really, really special. And you need to practice it a lot because it's like when you're waiting for that bird to take off and you don't know if he's going to be there for 10 seconds or 10 minutes. It's a strange way to photograph something.
These shots aren't saved as well. So the buffering while your fingers press down on it isn't actually saving those images until Ewen presses the button. That'll then save those 15 images before, and then the 20, depending on the burst mode, there's a few different options of how many that it will do after. So a couple of different options inside there. All
right. So we're almost there, Mitch. What I love about photography is that it brings me closer to my subject. That's like the whole thing. I didn't know that this bird looked like this until I got to take a photograph of it and to see all that detail and to see all that character. And you want to talk about some weird shapes. These robins, they have so many different kind of shapes depending on the angle that you shoot them from. I just love the way that by carrying this kind of camera, suddenly you get closer to the wildlife. And I guess the other thing is that I get so much reward for the effort. So I've got a series that's on my website called Walk With Me, where I go out to the park and I take some shots of birds and I come back and I create a video where I show you how I process the shots and I show you all the shots, the bad ones and all that kind of stuff. And I, so that I explain what my walk was like. And I'm just carrying this camera. It's such a compact camera that I can take to the park. So powerful, so much reach, and everything that I capture with that camera, I can use, its publication quality, and I get these amazing shots from just a walk in the park. And that's the thing, the reward for the effort is there. And I don't have to pack up the car with gear just to go and shoot some birds. I pop that camera into the bag and I jump on a tram and I'm at the park. And that's just an absolute joy to have something that's so easy to pack.
It's not 3 kilos of camera plus tripod and gimbal and all that sort of stuff. It's just 1.5 kilos that you're walking
That's
around
right.
with. So
that's right. So just to recap on the technical stuff, these are the things that for me have just absolutely changed how I feel about bird photography. The viewfinder is just fantastic. The precision autofocus control, the pre-burst mode is just wild. I'm getting these great 20 megapixel raw files. The dynamic range is great. This camera charges off the USB. So when I'm driving in the outback or Kenya, and I can just charge it off the car charger. I can charge it off a solar charger. If I'm in the hotel room, I can charge it off the laptop. If I'm not in the hotel room, I can charge it off the laptop.
So right now, while you're doing your live stream, you've got the camera plugged in a USB.
That's right. It's charging up. And 800 millimeter stabilized, so you can shoot things handheld. I don't need a tripod. It's just so easy to get about with this camera. And there you go. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to take over your screen there, Ewen.
Yep.
And so just a reminder, we have the Birding with Lumix competition running, where you get the opportunity to win a Lumix G9 and a 100 to 400. We've had plenty of great submissions. I think there's been over 600 on the Instagram handle. There's also been a whole bunch through on the Panasonic website. So we have the ability to log in on there and basically pop in your details. There's a link in the description of the YouTube video. This video will also be available to rewatch if there was something you missed or you didn't catch the start of the video. So another thing that we also announced when we announced that we were going to be doing this live stream with Ewen was the Panapix. So this is separate to the competition, and it's basically an opportunity for Panasonic to choose a couple of our favorites. Ewan's going to be choosing his favorite birding shot, but with Ewan's book called Reimagined. So it's a great coffee table book. There's plenty of beautiful images in there. Ewan, where are a couple of destinations and stuff that we've been in there?
So it's from literally every continent on the globe is in that book. So
it's a perfect thing to take a journey while we're obviously all in lockdown. So, well, not everyone, but both myself and yourself are in lockdown at the moment. So, so we wanted to announce that we've got a couple of winners in there of the Panapix. So we'll be in contact. We've got a nice, you actually haven't seen these shots
I haven't
yet. So a typical galah squawking in a parrot's face there, and obviously trying to tell him to get out of the way. And what are those? Are those kingfishers in the bottom?
They are. That's
in the bottom.
This Haycould kingfisher there.
I don't know what's up in the top right. Do you happen to know that, Ewan?
It's hard to see from here. It could be a triller of some sort. I'm not sure. I would have to look a little bit closer on that.
Great.
Nice shot.
So yeah, we'll be organising and getting in contact to send out those books to you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in. It's been really, I guess, a great experience to talk to Ewan about birding and his wealth of knowledge. Ewan's, I guess, I've done a lot of workshops with Ewan in the past, and in sort of, I guess, what did we have? We had the parrot walks that we did around the country, and they were a great opportunity to get out there and go and shoot. So yeah, unfortunately we can't do that, so we're limited to the live environment. But thank you very much, Ewan, for joining us. So
you're welcome. Thank you very much, and I can't wait to get out there again tomorrow and see what the birds are doing in the park.
Great. Thanks, Ewan. And yeah, hopefully you guys win a camera at the end. Remember to hashtag birding with Lumix. See ya.